Hello. Even if you are 18 or 20 years old, this lesson deals with events that have happened during your lifetime. So, lesson 12, the Western world in the last 25, 30 years. And that takes us to the last part of this introduction, and is the age of terrorism. I wanted to show you this because your book has plenty of information about what terrorism is, the definition of terrorism, why people resort to terrorism. But I wanted to show you this. This is a very interesting chart that places terrorism in the place within any violent conflict. We are so familiar with military operations, with war, and that is the traditional, common, constant conflict that we are familiar with, of violent conflict. So in violent conflict, you can go to the conventional way of fighting, and one of them is the usual war that we are used to. There is also something that is called a war crime, and that is usually the people involved in that war are not aware of how that war is perceived outside of the country. But sometimes a military operation seen as normal warfare within a country, within the country involved, is seen as criminal attacks or unjust attacks, and as war crimes from other parts of the world. But if we go to what is called non-conventional conflict, then we see how this is divided. And terrorism is one of the non-conventional conflicts. The other one is guerrilla warfare. What is interesting about terrorism is that, and you can see that and read that in the book, terrorism has different motives, different sides. It can be from the left, it can be from the right, but terrorism is seen in the world differently depending on your perspective. So what, for instance, one side can see as terrorism, the other side can see as freedom fighters. Throughout the Cold War, there were many either guerrilla warfare or terrorist events that the United States saw as freedom fighters, and of course in other parts of the world these people were seen as terrorists. Terrorist events don't have to be against a whole group. Sometimes they can be against one individual, and also sometimes a terrorist act can be committed by one individual, like in the case of Timothy McVeigh, for instance. It was three characters, three persons who organized the acts of terrorism. So it can be one individual, two or three, or it can be a whole group, or sometimes it can be a state, a country that supports terrorist acts. So this is more or less how terrorism is placed in relation to violent conflict in general. But as you read in the book, you could see that terrorism is motivated by different reasons. For instance, you could say that people are angry or upset about injustices whether political or economic injustices, and then they are going to start committing acts of terrorism. It can be because the international community is not paying any attention to a domestic problem in a country, and then terrorism will call attention to those problems. Sometimes terrorism begins with the desire of establishing a different type of regime, whether the regime is from the left or from the right. Sometimes, and that's what we are more maybe accustomed to see, sometimes terrorism can be performed when the people in a country or a territory feel that their land is occupied and they don't have the military capability of defending their land. And we see that, and we have seen that constantly among the Palestinian people. And recently, we saw that in Iraq or in Afghanistan when the United States invaded Iraq or Afghanistan. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, an entire government supports terrorist acts against another country or another government that is perceived as enemy, but it cannot be declared as enemy. And sometimes, as in this case, it's against the country or a person that society defines as enemy. I, for instance, could give you an example. When Osama bin Laden was killed, some people called that an act of terrorism by the United States, because Osama bin Laden was a declared enemy of the United States, and the United States went into another country to kill him. And so those are some acts that are defined as terrorist acts. But as I said, really terrorism is a very charged word because it depends on your perspective. What is terrorism for one person can be freedom fighting or defense of your territory by another group of people. And the last topic that we will discuss in this introduction, there are other topics in the lesson, but I wanted to focus on this, is specific acts of terrorism against the United States. This question, why, is a question that in your textbook is answered in, let me show you, in a section called the West and Islam, because it is the terrorism in the United States has been performed by, I would say, only by Islamic people. And the question is why? Well, that takes us to some events that have made Muslims angry at the United States. The first one was the invasion of Iraq in 1991, right at the end of the Cold War. That was the people, in fact, Osama bin Laden became anti-US because of that, because during the Gulf War, American troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia. And that was because Saudi Arabia allowed it. But still, Saudi Arabia, remember, is the center of Islam. Mecca is the most important and sacred city of Islam. And there were troops stationed there. And that made many Muslims angry. But another reason why there is terrorism against the United States is because Most Muslims in the world see the unconditional support of Israel by the United States as a slap in the face. And that has brought a lot of hatred toward the United States. Also, people in the Muslim world see what happened in 1953 in Iran, and then how the United States supported a Shah that was seen as autocratic, harsh, corrupt, and anti-Islam. And then when the 1979 revolution happened and the hostages were taken, all that conflict brought to the surface the antagonism that existed against the United States. On top of that, or in addition to that, Muslims see something that doesn't make sense for them. The United States talks about democracy and about supporting democratic regimes, but then Muslims see that the most anti-democratic regimes in Islam, in the Islamic world, are supported by the United States. Saudi Arabia is a very important example of that. And that makes many people in the Muslim world angry at what they see as total inconsistency. But not only the people in the Muslim world were angry at the United States, when the United States reacted to the horrible events of 2001 by invading first Afghanistan and then Iraq, people all over the world reacted against the United States. And that added to the feelings against the United States in Islam. That some of you were too little to remember, but I think that the time when the United States invaded Iraq was the most divisive period in the contemporary history of the United States. The entire country was divided. Not so much about the invasion of Afghanistan, but by the time President Bush, the second President Bush, decided to invade Iraq and the Iraq War began, the Americans were definitely divided, and the world was in general against the United States, with the exception of the British government. Practically everybody else opposed that invasion of Iraq. So reading the book, the last edition has interesting information about the invasion of Iraq. And that explains the relationship of the West with Islam. And as I mentioned before, the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan added to the negative feelings that Islam has for the United States.